My Story by Li Jiatong, translated by Daniel J. Bauer. Everybody can look back and recall classmates who were extremely good students. Of all my classmates in high school, Old Jiang was the smartest one of all. But Old Jiang was different than a lot of the superior students I knew, because he was always the type who was willing to help those of us who had a tough time in school. From day one, the two of us were always in the same class section. Back then, geometry always left me feeling down and discouraged. I could never figure out when and how to add an auxiliary line. Usually, we didn't bother much about our studies, until the time for exams drew near, that is. Then, fear would begin to percolate inside us. Old Jiang was always willing to step in as our voluntary private tutor. Our whole class would stay late on Saturday afternoons, and we'd listen intently as Old Jiang would guide us through various problems and questions. He was a good English teacher. For the longest time, I just couldn't grasp the difference between the present perfect verb tense and the simple past tense. Actually, the only one who could get it in the whole class was Old Jiang. He explained it, and presto, suddenly I understood. Old Jiang was the type of person who always had the wind at his back. From the time he was young, he had a good family and got good grades in school. He was in good shape, too. Yet Old Jiang always took care of people around him who were less fortunate than he was. It wasn't that he only helped classmates who had a tough time in school. He helped those with family troubles too. Years after everybody graduated, Old Jiang actually did pretty well in his business career, but he never accumulated much property. The reason was that he was forever donating money to charitable organizations. We all knew Old Jiang was on all counts a remarkably benevolent human being, but none of us ever wondered why there was so much kindness in his heart. We imagined he was just born that way. Another thing about Old Jiang that was special was that he had a gift for drawing caricatures. During class, he would secretly sketch pictures of our teachers. When we graduated from high school, he gave every classmate a portrait of themselves. The drawings all looked as if they had jumped out of a comic book. The expressions on our faces, a bit exaggerated. No one knew whether to laugh or cry. Old Jiang is retired now. His business passed on to his managers beneath him. He has maintained his interest, however, in animated cartoon figures. One day, he called on the telephone and invited me to drop by to see some software he had developed for animated drawings on a computer screen. This software was truly something to behold. It presented models of figures in 3 dimensions, what is sometimes called 3D. In the past, animated drawings featured characters that were literally drawn by hand. Now, there are special techniques to create 3-dimensional models for animated figures. The greatest advantage of this method are its flexibility and plasticity. Imagine we are watching 2 strong and husky male figures battling it out in a sword fight. Computer techniques allow us now to suddenly change one of the men into a sword-wielding woman warrior. Of course, we could also suddenly make it a clash between a pair of sword women. The most intriguing thing for me was seeing a young person performing magic acts. Old Jiang's software allowed him to turn abruptly into a Spider-Man. In a wink, he became a Batman. I asked Old Jiang if he could try out a model of an old man. "Of course," he replied, "but it'd make people laugh." In the end, that is precisely what he did. I saw an old fogey, nimble on his toes and lightning quick with his hands. It was a hilarious scene. I looked at still more of his animated drawings. One was a war story that had soldiers that could be changed into any nationality. Old Jiang explained they were trying to create a database and could even change the background scenes. Perhaps originally the war broke out in Europe, but now it could be changed to Asia. The soldiers could become our own Asian people. As I looked at all this, I became more and more enthralled. Old Jiang had an assistant who mentioned his great boss. He pointed to Old Jiang, had drawn many comics, and as a matter of fact, had put them into a DVD. I commented that I was quite interested in seeing that material. I asked Old Jiang to let me look at it. At first, he was unwilling to agree, but after I kept badgering him, he finally relented and gave me the DVD. I took that DVD home. I slipped the disc into my computer and opened it. In large lettering, 2 words came to the screen: "My story." Apparently then, these cartoon figures would tell Old Jiang's story. Here is the way it turned out. Inside that disc was one story after the other. A child was the main character in the beginning, but he always grew up and reached adulthood. Also, regardless of what generation it might be, the main character always resembled Old Jiang. Yet you knew as soon as you saw it that this was actually not Old Jiang's story at all, and in fact was precisely the opposite. None of the contents whatever showed anything that Old Jiang had personally gone through in his life. The first story was about the last battle the Kuomintang fought and lost against the communist soldiers in the winter of 1948 and early 1949 in the areas of Suzhou and Bangbu. That loss led to Chiang Kai-shek's flight to Taiwan. In Old Jiang's story, a child and his mother and father are forced to flee as refugees. For a long time, they make their way along a very crowded road. Finally, they reach the railway station, where the child's father promptly gets lost in the crowd. A train arrives at the station, and the children and mother enter one of the cars. When they get off the train later, however, they also find themselves separated in a great mass of people. The upshot of all this is that the child and his little brother are left to roam the streets of Shanghai. I knew Old Jiang was born and raised in Shanghai. When the communists took control of mainland China, his whole family emigrated to Taiwan. Old Jiang had obviously never been a beggar on the streets of Shanghai. That was the first animated cartoon story. The artistic techniques seemed a bit juvenile. Apparently, Old Jiang drew those figures when he was a child. All the stories that followed featured the same themes and the same main character, who was forever a most unfortunate chap. One of the stories showed him as a woefully inadequate physical education student, for example. He had a stomachache before every PE class in high school, and his teacher didn't have an ounce of sympathy for him. Another of the stories dealt with a high school dropout situation. The protagonist does well enough in his classes, but his family circumstances make it impossible for him to go to senior high. he has to go out and find a job. It so happens one day that as he pulls an ice cart along a street in Taipei, he bumps into a crowd of his old classmates. They are wearing their school uniforms, but he doesn't have a stitch on above his waist. He recognizes them, but they don't even know he exists. Again and again, I rolled this around in my mind, but I just could not fathom why he calls this my story. The title truly ought to have been Not My Story. Old Zhang's story was the absolute opposite of these stories. I called Old Zhang on the telephone, and he invited me to come over to his house and sit down for a conversation. He would tell me what this was all about. As a child, Old Zhang would whimper until his mother agreed to his pleas to take him to a movie. World War II had recently ended, and there were a lot of movies that presented war as praiseworthy. Old Zhang was just a boy then, and had a natural interest in airplanes. He saw a movie entitled Diary of the Bombing of Tokyo, and of course, the film showed close-ups of bombs falling like raindrops from the sky. He felt greatly excited by the camera shots of the bombs descending through the air to the earth below, and of the thick dark smoke that billowed upwards from all sides. His mother, sitting beside him, reminded him that he should remember there were people on the ground. After the movie had ended, his mother told him to imagine what the situation was like for the common people down below, and what they faced when a bomber flew overhead and dropped its payload. Not long afterwards, conditions became very chaotic. When Old Zhang was still in school, he discovered the streets were full of beggars. Then came the time when he knew what it was like when, in a short span of days, wave after wave of refugees, more than 1 million all told, flowed into the streets of Shanghai. Early on a Sunday morning, he was scampering about with a young buddy of his, when their eyes fell upon a dead beggar child. His body rolled right down a flight of steps leading into a building. In a state of shock, he and his little friend ran back home as fast as they could. Old Zhang was an elementary school student at the time, and he could read a newspaper. And it was from newspaper reports that he learned of the last Kuomintang communist soldiers' battle around Suzhou and Bangbu. 2 photos made an especially deep impression on his mind. One showed great crowds of refugees, masses as big as oceans and mountains, as they slowly moved along the highways. Another photograph had huge groups of refugees jammed into a train at a railroad station. His mother, aware of his newspaper reading, reminded him to put himself in the place of others. If I were a refugee, what conditions would I face? He asked himself. From the time he was young, he could draw comics. Thus, his mother urged him to let his drawings come from his imagination. That was when he sketched the first cartoon story. Its main character was a little boy who was forced to run for his life in a time of war. So, all through his life, Old Zhang always kept in mind his mother's words. Think of yourself as one of the unfortunate sons. So Old Zhang always pictured himself as a mediocre student, or saw himself weak in physical education classes, or with a lousy family background. Using his imagination like that filled his heart with benevolence. The reason the great majority of children raised in ideal circumstances cannot feel sympathy for others is that they have such a difficult time imagining what it is like to suffer. Without a doubt, the lessons his mother taught to Old Zhang helped him become very much the opposite of others. He could picture in his mind the miserable situations in which other people were thrown. Something else old Zhang told me was that his software was selling well in Europe and the United States because when a father gave his computer-savvy son his animated war games to play with, if the son watched the characters but was not affected by them, the father could put the boy in the role of one of the characters. This would give the boy a real jolt and impress him deeply about the reality of war. His software was like virtual reality, making things seem so realistic that you might forget that what you were looking at was imagined. The predicament of, say, a salesman could be experienced personally by others through the software. Old Zhang let me see an animated cartoon program he had just completed called Death of a Salesman. Many Americans had put themselves in the place of the main character there, and afterwards could feel in ways they had never thought possible. I keep thinking that if someone had given Napoleon an animated cartoon program to watch before he went to war, and if he knew beforehand his sons were to be among the casualties, perhaps he would not have gone to battle. In the end, I came to understand that old Zhang was not just born with a heart naturally full of sympathy. This was all due to his mother, whose earnest teaching and admonishments were the source of the goodness in his heart. The pain our unfortunate brothers and sisters encounter all over the world should always be in our hearts and minds. If all day long we think about how great we are, we become more and more proud of ourselves and find less and less compassion in our hearts. If all day long we imagine how miserable we are, we will become humble and develop hearts full of compassion.